Now it is my great pleasure to welcome Her Excellency Ambassador Hedda Sampson, Deputy Head of Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to share her opening remarks. Ambassador Sampson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Savita, and a warm welcome to everybody on behalf of the European Union to this important event organized by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And I think today's event is particularly timely because it gives us the opportunity to hear about the special risks that can occur, the risks of atrocity crimes in the context of elections and power transitions. And this is particularly relevant this year because we see major elections in more than 60 countries worldwide. As we all know, also from experience in our own countries within the European Union, that elections, of course, offer an opportunity to reaffirm our democratic norms and values and the rule of law, but they can also lead to increased polarization and sometimes even violence. In countries that are already affected by conflict or where peace is fragile, elections can present a serious risk to further political destabilization. This is very worrying, especially in the current context of global decline in democracy, respect for civil and political rights, which affects all regions of the world. We as EU are committed to working with partners to prevent or at least mitigate violence during elections. It's one of our top priorities when it comes to the work on conflict prevention. We analyze the risks of election-related conflicts in the context of our early warning mechanisms. And that way, we hope to be able to identify early on what are the risks and what tools to use to work on conflict prevention. And this includes mediation, dialogue, electoral support, electoral observation, security sector support, and so on. We do adopt a comprehensive approach, and I think it's important to stress that in this context, where we engage with a broad range of electoral stakeholders, which includes election monitoring bodies, but also political parties, security actors, civil society, and we really want to address the root causes of electoral violence. As always, we're very proud to support relevant civil society organizations and initiatives because we feel it's really crucial to strengthen all components of society to achieve a vibrant and sustainable democracy. Our engagement with civil society extends to the responsibility to protect and atrocity prevention as a universal responsibility. And this includes the support that we as EU are giving to the Global Center for Responsibility to Protect. The Global Center aims to build the capacity of national civil society organizations to provide early warning on atrocity crimes, but also provide recommendations to the EU, to the UN, to national governments, and last but not least, it increases our awareness and knowledge on relevant issues. And that is done through events like the one that we are participating in today. So with that as a kickoff, I want to wish all the participants a very successful event today. I will not be able to stay to the end, but I thank the Global Center for organizing, and I wish you all a very fruitful seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you so much for sort of kickstarting the discussion, because you very eloquently sort of, provided us a bit of a glimpse on what international actors can do to really promote peaceful elections and democratic elections. So thank you so much for that. And now, without much delay, let's go to our very esteemed panel. We are delighted to be joined by, these fantastic experts who will tell us more about not only the domestic side of things, but also how international mechanisms can be useful in promoting peaceful and democratic elections. I would like to first welcome Mr. Christopher Fognoyo, Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute. Edwin Diakani is with us. He's the Executive Director of the Community Empowerment for Progress Organization. Beatrice Borges, who's the Executive Director of the Justice and Peace Center. And last but not the least, Saeed Ali Hodzik, Principal Advisor for Elections, Conflict and Risk Management at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We are grateful for all of you for joining us today, and we hope that this is an interactive discussion between us all. So during your remarks or when you're answering the questions that I'm going to be posing, please keep your cameras on. Without further delay, I would like to go to Christopher. Christopher, in the context of elections, we sometimes observe volatile dynamics and risk factors for atrocities. How do you identify context-specific risks and warning signs for recurrence of atrocity crimes throughout the electoral period?
Well, thank you very much, Savita, for those very kind words of introduction, and Ambassador Sampson as well. And really appreciate the global leadership that the Global Center, as well as the EU delegations, do project on this very important topic. In response to your question, I should first say that I really like the way you frame the issue, because elections, we cannot say it enough, elections really derive their significance from the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that are also enshrined in the constitutions of every country on the surface of the earth, that allows citizens the rights to be able to choose their leaders and to renew their mandates regularly through meaningful and credible elections. We therefore must reinforce the message that elections are not a one-day event. They're not just the event that takes place on the day when citizens line up to cast their ballots. They are, they have to be considered as a full cycle, an electoral cycle that covers the entirety of the mandate of elected officials. Secondly, I would say that we have to know or learn the history of the countries in which we work that organize elections. You have to be able to know and learn in advance where the cleavages, the societal cleavages are, what the flashpoints could be, in order to watch over them and also publicize the early warning signs well in advance, to be able to allow all the actors, domestic as well as regional and international, to be able to intervene or intercede in a way that can curb violence and mitigate possibilities of atrocities and crimes. Thirdly, I have to say that we have to take a comprehensive approach to elections, because elections are the vector, you can say the vector or the barometer through which you can measure the efficiency of other pillars of democratic governance. And so it is just by the unique nature of elections and the fact that the elections involve this contract between elected officials and the globality of citizens, that it's through elections that you can determine, for example, whether the legislative branch of government is effective enough in enacting laws that allow a legal framework in which peaceful elections could be conducted, or whether the judiciary is independent enough to make rulings that address the grievances of citizens, so those grievances don't boil to the surface in terms of violence, whether the security sector is professional enough to provide electoral security in a way that can curb the possibility of violence, or whether by their unprofessionalism or by their actions in a biased fashion, they exacerbate tensions in a way that can then spill over into full-blown violence. And I think that when you take this very comprehensive approach, it makes the case for why in every country, all citizens must take ownership of the electoral process and work collectively to make sure that elections can be meaningful, successful, and also peaceful. Because when they are, they lift up other pillars of democratic governance. But of course, when they fail, as has happened in a number of countries, unfortunately, then we can see the disaster that follows with the loss of lives and destruction of property and tremendous violations of human rights.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for starting us off with that very thoughtful answer, because I totally agree with you that elections are such an important barometer for measuring a democracy in a way, and sort of the credibility of other institutions which support the conduct of a peaceful and a fair election. So that's a very, very important point. And I really like the way you framed it, that elections are not just on the day that they occur, it's a process. And we have to understand the process to understand the risk factors. We have to understand the context to understand the risk factors. So thank you so much for starting us off with that. Now I would like to move to Sayad. Your organization, International IDEA, has published 2 guides on electoral risk management that identify both internal and external risk factors and design prevention and mitigation strategies to these potential threats. Can you elaborate on how these factors might manifest throughout the different phases of an electoral cycle and how they contribute to the potential outbreak of election-related violence or the commission of possible atrocities?
Thank you indeed. Good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, of course, to those who are across the sea. And thank you, Christopher, for making really good introduction. I mean, I can refer to many of the all points which were made by Christopher in front of me. Now, I'm always excited to sense the pulse of the audience, and I sometimes go off my script. So I will start by saying something I didn't plan, which is International IDEA started working into election-related violence following the episode in Kenya 2007 and 2008. And I think it's always a good reminder to remember that post-electoral violence in Kenya took over more than 1,000 lives, caused the displacement of 500,000 people, it costed Kenyan economy $2.5 billion. And then it really sent the tectonic shocks across the region because many countries rely on Kenyan infrastructure. And it was an effort of Kofi Annan to mediate peace and so on. And I think we all, the world was traumatized with what has happened there. And International IDEA has decided to really invest in developing electoral violence early warning tool. And that was the time when I joined IDEA. I came from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I worked for a number of years with the post-conflict elections, and security has been quite challenging. So we learned from many election management bodies and organizations like yours and others. So we try to bring together research and practice. And as we developed electoral violence early warning tool, we were actually advised by Election Commission in Mexico in particular. They said, don't call it electoral violence early warning tool because we want to use it, but we will never be able to run electoral violence early warning systems, right? So then we had a long discussion and we decided, well, actually, the way to call it is electoral risk management, because under the hub, risk management and electoral violence just follow the same philosophy, but risk management is something which is a important management standard for government organizations, and early warning, we know that it is essential component of the efforts to prevent, mitigate, and respond to violent outbreaks. Now, indeed, in 2013, we launched the first version of the electoral risk management tool, and 3 guides. 2 were on electoral risk factors, and 1 was on prevention and mitigation. And they have been broadly used ever since. But I think the reason to divide them into 3 is because we want them to tell a part of the story and not to lose the perspective. And the story is that organization of elections is a very complex. Many things can go wrong, and when it happens, or when there is a perception of it, elections can experience or trigger violence, right? So we are talking about process that is very complex, And then when things go wrong, or if there is perception, it can trigger or contribute triggering violence. And this is something that is captured by our guide on internal risk factors. We, as Chris said, we look into whole electoral cycle. We try to go from one to another. We describe 26 factors which contribute or contribute to triggering election-related violence. And there, we did not focus or try to rank factors to say, yes, it is most common that electoral violence is experienced during the campaign phase or voting period, but we can't miss the fact that many countries experience violence at the time when electoral legislation or institutions are created for elections. If they are not trusted, we have seen the outbreaks of violence. The second episode in this story is that elections need to very often to be navigated through context in which violence already exists, or they are very prone to violence. And then such violence can spill over and affect electoral processes, be it electoral actors, events, or materials, right? So for election management bodies, it is very often, I compare them with the captains who need to navigate ship through rocky waters, right? Even if the ship is very solid, if the environment in which they sail is rough, it can turn out to be problematic for them. And then when it comes to prevention and mitigation, which is the last part of the puzzle, it is to say that very often efforts to prevent and mitigate election-related violence require capacity and mandate that exceeds a single organization, right? And this is where we have developed a guide on prevention and mitigation of election-related violence. And it was huge research, so we never updated following 2013, but we provide 100 empirical cases, and we actually established the relationship. We say the effective prevention and mitigation happens when three kind of type of stakeholders come together. Of course, election management body and dispute resolution organizations cannot ignore the violence. They need to be sensitive to conflicts and violence. Then security sector agencies play major role, but then they really need to understand specifics of electoral processes and how their engagement can really endanger human rights if security sector agencies are not well trained. But then there is this huge potential, which is often by the UN and few other agencies. They have a lot of resources on infrastructures for peace, and which is basically understanding that every society has its own peace-building fabric. And we see civil society organizations, we see media, religious leaders, traditional leaders, business community, that when engage in promoting a peaceful conflict resolution, they can really have a big leverage in supporting efforts to prevent and mitigate election-related violence. This is to say again that let's not forget that the election-related violence is a complex space to cover is very broad, and the electoral risks don't work in isolation, so should not responses to them. Thank you. I'll stop here.
No, thank you so much for sort of laying out the. I mean, I really like that we framed it by reminding us all that that what happened in Kenya, and it's really important to sort of place this discussion within the context that elections can lead to atrocity crimes. And thank you so much for doing that. And I'm so looking forward to looking at the tool that your organization has developed, because it sounds really interesting in how you sort of lay out that it's not only the electoral body or election commissions, but sort of an environment that enables elections which don't lead to violence. So thank you so much for that. Edmund, then I'll go to you. While not yet confirmed, South Sudan's long-delayed elections are intended to be held by December 2024. Multiple actors within the multilateral system have warned that these elections may heighten tensions, leading to an environment conducive for the commission of atrocity crimes. What specific election-related atrocity risk factors do you currently see? And what strategies would you recommend to mitigate any potential triggers for violence before, during, and after elections in South Sudan? Edmund, the floor is yours.
Sorry, my network. I'm in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, in Civil Society Conference of East Africa. I'm a sitting president of East African Civil Society. So my network here is very weak in the hotel. If you can allow me, let me put off my video and I go audio. Is it allowed? Yeah. Are you getting me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you so much.
Yes.
We hear you clearly, Edmund.
In a better way. My name is Edmond Yakani. I work as Executive Director of a national NGO called Community Empowerment for Progress Organization, CEPO. We are now keenly engaged in the political transition in South Sudan since 2013. And recently, we are also sitting in Kenya under the Tumaini Initiative, which is a mediation between the government and the non-signatories to the peace agreement, the revitalized peace agreement. But also because the subject is election, I want to give a bit of track record. Who am I in terms of elections? I'm one of the founder of a network, domestic network funded by NDI, which is an American funded. It's called Sunde. I was a founding member. And we observed the 2010 elections in Sudan by then before our independence. And then also we observed our referendum. So right now in South Sudan, we are involved in pre-election observation. We have already issued like 3 reports of pre-election observations. And we had got a grant from EU through a German firm called FS. We're working also on elections. And I'm closely engaged with our National Election Commission. Just to go to the subject, this is a bit of background, so at least inform the audience who am I and the background where I'm coming from. One of the biggest things in South Sudan is we are expecting South Sudan to be holding election in December 2024. The preparation is really, really below. It's below standard. I would like to say administratively, operationally, legally, South Sudan may not hold election in December 2024. Why? Because of so many factors that I like to share. One, still we have multiple army across the country, and some of this army belong to the parties that are signatory to the peace agreement. So they're not yet unified. It means we can't go for election with more than one army. That by itself, it offers a threat. In the legal framework, the national election law in South Sudan have a lot of disputes. There's a huge mathematical problem in terms of calculation of constituency that require to be delimited. That was another constraint. Besides this, the elections have its own preconditions required by the agreement. One of them is that we can't go for elections without a permanent constitution. So as we speak now, we don't have any constitution at hand. So that is a context that we're in. But I want to dive directly to the subject matter. As a civic actor in South Sudan, our role is to make sure we raise the bar of sensitizing our citizens on the provisions of the agreement, which respond to the political transition. We also make sure that we hold the parties that are entrusted by the agreement to implement the peace agreement, which is within the context of a transitional process. So within the aspects of our political transition as a civic actors are the elections. Now we have the following constraints that as we're trying to sensitize citizens, disseminate the agreement, provide oversight of observing the parties and implement the agreement, because we render our own observation reports as a civil society to the parties and to the government about their commitment to implement the agreement. In the phase of doing this activity as a civic actor in a political transition process in South Sudan, we are facing challenges. What are among our key challenges? Our key challenge is that civic space is shrinking. It's shrinking. That's one thing that we feel. And why is it shrinking? Because we realize that as a civil actor, we become more vocal and we become more citizen driven actor, and the incumbent government, which is composed of the government incumbent by then, and then the opposition that signed the agreement, which formed the government of national unity. They see us civil actors as a new merging opposition to them. So, and that's what contributes to the shrinking of the civic space. And this at a moment where you are in a post-conflict situation where you don't have a very strong political opposition players. So we civic actors have been seen by the government as opposition, while actually we are demanding them to exercise the responsibility of social contract. So this is one of the key challenges we have, that civic space is shrinking. The second thing is that as civic space is shrinking, government is trying their level best to infiltrate the civil actors, in the sense of government either sends spies to civil actors, or they try to threaten a new merging activists that are coming up. For people like us who are already old in the space, they couldn't really treat us badly, but any new merging activists, they brutally handle. And you come to realize new merging civil actors are always leaving the country, and they're living in the neighboring countries like Uganda, Kenya. Most of them are there. They're not in country. And you might have heard about when the number of actors, of civil actors, came together and established what we call PCCA, which is like a people's civil disobedience movement, which is non-violent. It's just to keep holding leaders accountable. That may lead to things like possible public protest, like what we have seen in Sudan. All my colleagues who established that group were kicked out of Juba. That's something that, as a part of a key challenge. Besides this, also, as the civic space is shrinking, the government is infiltrating us. We are getting cases no longer of deregistration, but attack of civil actors through their family members or through their relatives. So you come to realize that if you are a very strong, influential civil actor, either your family members will be used by the government to actually threaten you and give you a hard time by saying, look here, you need to stop this business of civil actor because it's posting a threat to the family. Or you come to realize that either your children or your wife has been threatened by state agencies, and that creates more pressure on you at home. So those are some of the key actors that we see. Are there entry points? Are there opportunities in this space? I would like to say yes, there's opportunities. What are opportunities that exist? The opportunities that exist first, citizens are so demanding that they need to go to a polling station because they believe the only instrument for transfer of power in a post-conflict situation like South Sudan is only through voting. People are tired of seeing the transfer of power through a military struggle. So that for me is an opportunity because citizens are out there demanding for successful political transition through elections. And I think for me, that's an entry point. So the question comes is, how do we move as civil actors from being as an organizations? How do we move to fix ourselves as players within the citizens? How do we act as a convenience for the citizens so that we spread the risk that is direct to us as a civil actor? So the question comes, if we say we're civil actors who represent citizens, how do we establish citizens' constituency? That is now the citizens demanding. Our role is only to facilitate, to create a space. So for me, that's a big opportunity that citizens are demanding. That's one opportunity that it exists. The second opportunity in South Sudan is that the incumbent government is faced with political legitimacy issue post-December 2024 because they have extended the government several times. Right now, that's why they opened the window of mediation to be held in Kenya under the Tumaini initiative. That for me also gives us an opportunity that we can push the political leaders because they have realized that they are at a crossroad where their political legitimacy is going to be questionable. Without elections, we can push, and that one can give us an opportunity to demand for certain political reforms that secure for us a very inclusive and open political engagement, civic engagement in the political transition. So for me, that does offer the opportunity. What can we recommend other actors like multinational actors? And in South Sudan, as we speak now, there are something what we call a trilateral instrument. The trilateral instrument is a coming together of UN, AU, and IGAD. So they have established something called a trilateral task force, which is mainly intended to support the government in implementing the elections. And you might have seen the new mandate of UNMISS, which is the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, is almost 80% electoral focused. So what do you do? We normally, as a civil actor, we intend, as I speak now, and I confirm with the last speaker about the issue of the early warning. We realize that in South Sudan now, as civil society, we have established a post-electoral early warning system. We have established clearly 5 spots that even if you are to meet all the requirements for creating a good enough conditions for elections, you have unified the army, you have the constitution, you have done everything, we realize as an organization that there's a 5 spots, whether we like it or don't like it, whether the election is going to be democratic, the election is going to be peaceful, there's a likelihood of breakout of violence. Let me mention the 5 hotspots, the characteristics that we qualify through our early warning system.
And can we keep this bit for the second part of the question, because I want to give the floor to BB now. Is that fine?
It's fine.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you. No, thank you so much for sort of laying out those conditions. And it's really very troubling to know that how civil society, which is doing a fantastic job in making the government more accountable, is actually, you know, developing or emerging as an oppositional force to the incumbent government. That, you know, you are also facing a lot of risks. So, you know, it's really a privilege to have you here and to hear from you, the brave voices in South Sudan who are really giving a counter to the government and the government narrative. So thank you so much for that response, and we will sort of unpack the other stakeholders in your next response. But Bibi, now I would like to come to you, because I think that, you know, Edmund really put us in that space. So civil society organizations have, in Venezuela, in the context of Venezuela, have emphasized the need for the deployment of an international election observation mission to Venezuela ahead of the scheduled presidential elections that will take place on 28th July. How does, if you can elaborate on this, how does how do independent election observations aid in mitigating risk factors and prevent the commission of atrocity crimes?
Thank you, Savita, and I hope you hear me well. My connection is weak, but I hope you can hear me. Well, okay, thank you so much. I just want to start to say thank you for this invitation, because it's important for Venezuelans have the crisis currently is in our country being knowledge for the international forums, but also for linking this topic of election and human rights violations that is not always seen in the same space, no? And this I want to start from that, because in authoritarian governments like Venezuela, this where severe human rights violation has been happening years. In the moment, international observation plays a vital role. One thing that happened with Venezuela separates the electoral and political issues from human violations. In authoritarian governments, severe human rights violations rooted in politics. The government commit them to stay in the power. And why we understand how operate this sophisticated system of corruption, which activates every when the government sees there is a threat, they can lose the power. That's why citizen organizations, elections, and protests are the moments where the repression grows. And for many years, Venezuelan government has been implementing strategies to discourage electoral participation with many irregularities that led many to the opposition to go out of election. The politics told
we have lost BB. BB, maybe it'd be better to just keep your keep your camera off, so maybe we can hear you better.
Okay. Well, I was telling that for many years, political thought that have this international observation in a no-fair election is something that was not work because it validates no fair elections. But in 2021, the Venezuelan begins to understand the importance of participating even in the authoritarian context and change the strategy to support negotiation and election, even though this doesn't have all the guarantees, the elections. And in this context, the request for international observation mission by civil society and the recognition of the relevance by politicians make a significant change and impact. Having these eyes of actors such as the European Union and the UN panel of experts has been fundamental. These missions and report irregularities, but also provide international visibility to the situation in Venezuela, helping to ensure the violations don't be invisible in this context. Although the 23 recommendations of the 21 election in Venezuela has not been fully implemented, these recommendations has served as a framework for identifying areas that need the improvement. But something that we are seeing right now is that we need this continuous monitoring and international pressure based on this standard, because they are essential to promoting a significant reform, but also to mitigate the violence, the political violence. At this moment that I'm talking here, I just received from my colleagues in Venezuela news about the detentions of one mayor in Venezuela, and also the threat to detention for 12 more. Since the year start, there has been 37 detentions of politicals regarding to the election, and 20 of them still detained. And we have been documenting more than 200 cases of political persecution. I think in conclusion, international electoral observation in Venezuela is indispensable for mitigate abuse because we are in an authoritarian context. Also help to the documentation and in international visibility this mission not only highlight the deficiencies and the abuse, but provide the framework for progress and increase the cost of violation. This contributing to the international pressure for free and fair elections in our country that we see as the way and the path to recover democracy. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for that, Bibi. And that's such an important, observation that you made, that presence of international observers may not necessarily prevent all kinds of violence, but what it does is that it gives that violence visibility. It gives the violations visibility, and that what is ongoing currently. But yeah, I mean, the situation in Venezuela seems very, very grim, and sort of the systematic attack on the political opposition is really problematic. So thank you so much for that. Seyat, now I will go to you. So while preventive measures ahead of elections often focus on institution building, democratic standards and ensuring electoral fairness, they rarely include atrocity prevention or human rights monitoring. Yeah. So how can electoral legislation, including the legal, operational, technical, and political aspects of electoral processes, be enhanced to better address and mitigate the risk of atrocities?
Right, indeed, there is a lot to be done, but let me start by saying that election-related atrocities, and we have heard from the colleagues, they are highly contextual, and efforts to prevent and mitigate them need to be adjusted accordingly. But I think if we assess the safeguards against electoral atrocities, I think we need to look into three areas. One is the legal framework, right? Whether this is the matter which has specific provision in the legal framework, and what are the provisions, and to which extent the election law may be conducive to prevention and mitigation of election-related violence, then the second one would be even if the law is good and robust, and I think there is no law which kind of promotes and favors election-related violence, then it's really about assessing the capacity of state and non-state actors to prevent and mitigate election-related violence, right? Again, as I was previously saying, there are organizations, 3 types of organizations, and some of them do have a strong mandate, such as security sector agencies. Election management bodies by default should be conscious about and conflict sensitive. And then there are these infrastructures for peace. And I think it is great how you compose the panel, because we could hear experiences from different parts of the world, because civil society organizations and other, they play very, very important role in making sure that prevention and mitigation happens. And so the capacity, and third is the process. It is sometimes you have a good laws, you do have a mandates, but you have simply people who, again, don't know what is the most effective way to approach and to address some issues. And I can tell you, like I've been, the worst case scenario, again, is what we have heard from the colleagues, is when those who are committing atrocities are part of the state apparatus. And that happens in many countries. And actually, it is only the civil society, colleagues like, for example, what we heard from Edmond and Patrice, they are on the front line, and very often it comes to support that they have from international community in observing and monitoring the state of human rights in the elections. But then they very often expose themselves, and then at least they require support, which is financial and diplomatic support to their effort. But then when the state is genuinely interested in having peaceful elections, again, state security agencies need to be sensitized to electoral processes. And then we have seen in countries which have continuous problems with election-related violence, we have seen how election management bodies could actually develop skill, capacities, and specialization. For example, in Mexico is one of the greatest examples from which I learned. If you just look into Mexico, I learned you cannot really think about the country and the strategy from the country. In every state, they do have a different strategies, and sometimes these strategies are contradictory. So what they do in one Mexican state, if they try to apply it in another one, it would just cause contrary effects. And they are, I think, very good. The extent to which Election Commission of Nigeria, INEC, has been, or Kenyan Election Commission have been kind of stepping into this space to coordinate work of other agencies, to involve civil society organization, to hear them. I think these are places to learn from. Also, Indian Election Commission does have a capacity and does have a mandate, and they are, I think, good case on how they can command and direct security sector agencies in making sure that they can navigate through communal violence. Again, best practice is always the one in which they really come together, they have a talk, and political parties that can be sometimes, for them, stakes are high, and they will do anything sometimes to win elections. I think what is very useful were experiences from the countries in which political parties sign a code of conduct in which they commit to respecting election results and so on. And then there are countries who have been more effective in making sure that these codes of conduct are followed, and there are some in which they fall through the cracks. But I think we have good and bad cases to learn from. Thank you.
No, thank you, Sayad, and thank you for such a rich tapestry of examples that you provided with Mexico, Nigeria, and India. And there's so much that one can learn, and context matters. And you're so right. I mean, in the end, it's also so much about capacity. You know, you can have the best laws, but if you don't have the capacity and the willingness to carry it out, then that doesn't work. But that's a fantastic response. Thank you so much for that. Chris, now coming to you, building up on what Sehar just said, can you provide examples of when domestic, regional, and international actors implemented measures to mitigate atrocity risks following election-related violence? Can you provide some examples for us?
Sure. In the interest of time, I'll go straight to the point and share just three examples in terms of domestic actors, building on what Seth said with regards to codes of conduct. In a number of countries, the codes of conduct signed by political leaders have helped to curb violence because it sent a strong message to the leaders and to their supporters that everyone will play by the rules and everyone will work to ensure peaceful elections. We've also seen in a country such as Côte d'Ivoire that domestic groups have gotten together to conduct programs that reinforce social cohesion. For example, after the very controversial presidential elections of 2010, after which there was a lot of violence that led to the loss of over 3,000 lives in Côte d'Ivoire, civil society organizations began to work in communities at the grassroots level to build inter-party dialogue, to foster inter-party dialogue. And till today, we now have those kinds of organizations at the local level in which representatives of all the political parties are present, where the key terms of reference are to watch out for flashpoints and to make sure that they can quickly respond to those flashpoints at the local level. And that, in my view, explains why the 2015 and 2020 elections in Côte d'Ivoire were not as violent as the 2010 elections. On the regional and international scale, I will point to another example that Syed alluded to earlier, when Kofi Annan or the Kofi Annan Foundation, working with the African Union and other leaders in East Africa, came together in the post-election period in Kenya, after the very violent elections of 2007, 2008, to bring all the parties together and get them to agree on a government of national unity. That was also replicated in Zimbabwe in 2009, after other very violent elections. And while the governments of national unity have probably not worked well in the long term, in the immediate term, they've stopped the bleeding, and they've also provided an environment where preparations for the next elections could be better than had happened in the elections that were violent and during which crimes and atrocities were committed. And then the last example that I would share is something that the International Criminal Court did for Nigeria, or with regards to the Nigerian elections in 2015. Because in the lead up to those elections, looking at those societal cleavages in Nigeria, there were already early warnings that those elections could be very violent. In fact, there was already a lot of violence being recorded in the campaign period in a number of states in Nigeria. And in February 2015, a month before the elections, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued a very strong warning, a very strong statement that was publicized all across Nigeria, that any perpetrators of violence would be held personally accountable, either by the Nigerian courts or by the International Criminal Court. Because if there were crimes that violated the Rome Statute, that would give jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court to step in and to take actions. And that statement alone, as powerful as it was, this sent a strong signal that helped curb violence and that allowed Nigeria to have a peaceful election in 2015, which turned out to be a historic election because for the first time in Nigerian history, political power changed hands from the ruling party to the opposition party through the ballot box. And that strengthened Nigeria's democracy, which is still ongoing in its 25th year since the transition from military rule. So there are examples where domestic actors can come together and work to curb violence. It's always helpful and useful if their efforts, as was demonstrated by Beatrice and Edmond, if their efforts can be amplified by other international partners who reinforce their messages reinforce their hard work, and work in partnership with them to guarantee peaceful and credible elections. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Chris, for giving us, again, I mean, amazing examples of how different actors at different levels can work together and ensure that elections don't lead to atrocity crimes and high-level violence. So, no, that's really, really amazing. Thank you for that. And Bibi, now coming back from a very broad conversation, coming back to Venezuela again, what role do UN human rights mechanisms play during pre- and post-electoral periods? I think you alluded to that in your previous answer about sort of the recommendations provided by the FFM on Venezuela and their impact. But how do these mechanisms contribute to preventing and addressing potential human rights abuses and violations associated with the election process?
Well, the international mechanism about human rights protection and in general with multiple dimensions has been crucial because to attain the humanitarian crisis and also the human rights crisis and the mobility crisis need all these comprehensive view. But also in terms of electoral observation mission, attain in a timely manner in Venezuela is important. Many of the situations in Venezuela, they think that are in the day of the elections, but they happen before the elections. And have this in 2 weeks, we are gonna have the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and also we have the investigation of Venezuela in International Criminal Court, and also we have the 5 animation about Venezuela, and these are the 3 virtuous organisms that are documenting situations in Venezuela regarding to political persecution, but also regarding to this electoral context that increase the political persecution. This practice of political persecution is not only violating human rights that are being underlined for this organism, but also create an atmosphere and did fear and uncertainty in a political way. That's why have this organism active and this mandate to be renovated and has the focus in the crisis in Venezuela are crucial for Venezuelans, are crucial for the future of the democracy, and are crucial in this opportunity of elections that Venezuelan has hope that the change could be possible.
No, thank you so much for that, Bibi. And I'm not going to repeat the very important points that you brought up in the interest of time. Edmund, I very rudely interrupted you last time, but can you again elaborate on the different actors and the role that they can play and in supporting civil society organizations, but in supporting the peaceful elections in South Sudan? Can you elaborate on that? That would be fantastic.
Thank you. Actors that we have on the ground that can support civil society in regard to elections, mainly we have the UN through the UN peacekeeping mission in South Sudan, where its mandate are now renewed, much more focusing on elections. We have African Union, we have IGAD on the ground, and we have donors like EU. EU have given us a grant, as I mentioned before. Those grants EU gave us is helping us to reach out to the citizens. But of course, the priority that for civil society have to engage is really having a proactive election observation, what do you call domestic election observation missions or deployment of civil society. Because as some of the speakers have mentioned before, that normally we tend to use election domestic observation, meaning it international, regional, or domestic, when we are almost rolling out the elections. For us now in South Sudan, we have experienced that actually having a post-election domestic observation help us to identify hotspots, like what I've mentioned already. We know 5 hotspots that we're engaging on. And we believe that these hotspots, even if things are to go democratic, still we're going to have a crisis. So any external supporter that wants to support civil society, like for example in South Sudan for election, is really support towards deployment of domestic observers, because international observers will come at late moment, at a moment that already the polling stations have been rolled out and then people are going to go for polling station to vote. So I feel institutions like UN, institutions like AU, like IGAD, like donor community, like EU, if they can adapt our approach of supporting civil society, specifically in post-conflict situations like South Sudan, where we're transition from violence to peace through and peace agreement, and the peace agreement end up with the elections. There's a need to support a prior elections domestic observation exercise that focuses at aspects that have been mentioned with some of the speakers, issues of security sector actors. You need to engage them to understand, and you need to agree on where is the hotspot so that we have a proper deployment. You need to educate people where if you identify hotspots, how should they avoid violence? And with the political parties, like what other speakers have said about code of conduct, that a political party signed code of conduct prior elections. And we have worked on that as a CEPO together with the UN Peacekeeping Mission, with the Political Parties Council, which is in charge of the political parties registration and governance. We have established a code of conduct, in which the code of conduct is to help the political parties to adhere to the principle of free, fair, credible, and non-violent. But also we have introduced what we call a citizens' pledge for peaceful elections, where citizens pledge and voluntarily come and sign, we want to go for elections, but we want to go in a non-violent way. So I think those are the areas that international community can support. Besides that, claiming the civic space, because the more elections are getting closer, the more civic space is shrinking. And as my sister mentioned in Venezuela, when she's talking about Venezuela, is exactly like she's speaking about South Sudan. So in terms of the civic space globally, we share similar challenges and we have similar opportunities if we can coordinate. So for me, that support is very important. And that will help us to get, because at the end of the day, elections is determined by the level of trust and confidence, either between parties that are facing the elections, citizens, and then even institutions like National Election Commission. Once they lack confidence and trust on holding election, that's going to be tough. So for me, these are the areas we need to support. Civil society deserve to be supported for a successful political transition in a country like South Sudan, where it is a post-conflict, and we are transitioning through implementation peace agreement. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Edmund, and thank you both, Beatrice and Edmund, for sort of shining a light on very contextual factors that can influence elections, and sort of the role of trust, the role of capacity, the role of civic space is so important in ensuring. But I would like to, time is up, I would have liked to continue this conversation, as this is a very rich and interesting conversation, and I would have liked to hear more about all your experiences. But in the interest of time, we will have to stop now. But thank you so much to each one of you, Christopher, Sayad, Beatrice, and Edmund, for participating in today's discussion. A recording of this event will be available later today and on our website, so you can access it anytime. I hope that we can continue this conversation with each one of you and learn more from each one of you on how to make sure that elections that are a big news item this year, as Hera said, there are 60 elections ongoing, result into really a true expression of people's will and a true expression of democracy and citizens' rights. So thank you very much for all your remarks, and I wish you a fantastic day ahead. Let's continue the conversation.